The ability to keep going not once, not sometimes, but relentlessly is not a mystery. It's not reserved for the elite. It's not encoded into the DNA of a chosen few. It's biology, it's structure, it's trainable. There are systems inside your brain designed to power you through resistance, distraction, and fatigue. Drive is not something you're born with. It's something you wire. The idea that some people are naturally more motivated, more determined, more relentless is a myth that breaks under the weight of neuroscience. Because what we call drive isn't mystical, it's neural. It's the result of specific circuits in the brain that determine whether you lean in or back away, whether you start or stall, whether you move through resistance or retreat from it. These circuits are built through experience, repetition, exposure to challenge, and the decisions you make when every part of you wants to stop. And the most important truth is this: they can be changed. Inside the brain, there are pathways, specifically dopaminergic ones, that are responsible for generating pursuit, momentum, and sustained effort. These aren't philosophical ideas. These are physical structures that either fire consistently or remain dormant depending on how you train them. When you sit in comfort, they shrink. When you face effort and stay with it, they grow. And the more you activate these circuits under stress, the more your brain learns to associate action with reward. That is how drive becomes a state not of excitement but of obedience, not emotional hype but deep internal readiness. Every time you act when you don't feel like it, every time you take one more step despite fatigue, you are not just getting something done. You are rewiring your brain. You are literally strengthening the synaptic pathways that say, "We go forward." You are building a nervous system that recognizes pressure as a signal to move, not to hide. That's what separates those who chase goals relentlessly from those who quit halfway. Not talent, not inspiration, but a brain that has been trained through fire to keep going. And that training is available to anyone. It doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for practice. There is something sacred in choosing effort over ease. There is something spiritual in the act of motion when the body screams for stillness, because that's the moment you are deciding not just what you'll do, but who you'll become. You're not waiting for the drive to show up. You are becoming the one who creates it. And once your brain begins to see effort as a path to meaning, it will crave that effort. It will reward that strain. It will reinforce that forward motion, not because of what's at the end, but because of what it learns to feel in the middle. That's where relentless drive is forged, not in the moment of victory, but in the unseen repetition of choosing discipline when distraction would be easier. You are not stuck. You are not lacking. You are simply untrained, but that can change, and it changes the moment you stop treating drive as a feeling and start treating it as a system. It is not reserved for the elite. It is not granted by luck. It is built one choice at a time, one neural firing at a time, one moment of grit repeated until the circuits can no longer forget what you've taught them. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure, but it is far more than that. It is the molecule of pursuit. It is what drives you to act, to strive, to move towards something that doesn't yet exist. It is the currency of motivation, and it flows not when you receive the reward, but when your brain senses that the reward is possible. It is released in anticipation, not celebration, and the more your system learns to associate that dopamine release with effort rather than outcome, the more relentless your drive becomes. Because then it's not the finish line that fuels you, it's the running itself. This system is ancient, powerful, and built to ensure survival by making the process of seeking feel meaningful. But in the modern world, that same system can be hijacked by distractions, instant gratification, endless scrolling, and empty achievements. Dopamine gets pulled away from meaningful long-term goals and tethered to short-term spikes that feel good for a moment and leave you depleted after. The brain's pursuit circuitry becomes numb, weakened, conditioned to expect a reward without effort. And once that happens, the harder paths, the ones that require consistency, discipline, and real vision, start to feel unreachable, not because they are, but because the brain no longer knows how to chase them. But this is not permanent. The beauty of this system is that it can be retrained. You can teach your brain to release dopamine for the right things. For effort, for struggle, for the forward movement that defines growth. This happens when you deliberately attach meaning to the act of showing up, not just the outcome. When you shift your attention toward the process and tell yourself, this right now is the win, that shift is not imaginary. It rewires the dopaminergic response. You start to feel energized by the doing, not just the achieving. And over time, your brain becomes your ally in the pursuit, not just in the celebration. The key is repetition. Every time you acknowledge effort, every time you celebrate discipline, every time you anchor satisfaction to progress rather than perfection, you are literally building a system that wants to keep going. This is how high performers, creators, athletes, and leaders sustain themselves. They've conditioned their dopamine pathways to fire when they move, not just when they arrive. They've trained their brains to crave the process, and once that happens, you become almost unstoppable. Because the fuel doesn't come from the outside, it is generated from within. You are not chasing a reward, you are creating one with every step. You are not at the mercy of moods, you are sculpting neurochemistry through movement, through intention, through alignment. Dopamine is not your master, it is your signal, and when that signal is paired with action instead of fantasy, something extraordinary happens. You become driven not by outcome, but by the deep, biological joy of pursuit, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And because hard is now the source of your strength. You can anchor motivation to action, not outcome, and when you do, everything changes. The mistake most people make is believing they need to see results in order to feel motivated, but results are delayed. They take time, and the brain that depends on them for drive will starve in the waiting. What the nervous system responds to immediately is movement, initiation, forward motion, even if it's small. When you anchor your internal reward system to that first step rather than the final win, you stop being dependent on external validation. You create your own fuel, and that fuel is available at all times because action is always available. Inside the brain, motivation isn't a passive state. It's a loop. It begins with an intention, followed by action, followed by a chemical response. And the more you complete that loop, the more efficient it becomes. This is why routines are powerful. This is why rituals work, because they allow you to generate dopamine not by fantasizing about the outcome, but by doing the thing itself. You wake up, you breathe deliberately, you move your body, you write the first line, you press start. And your brain says, yes, we are in pursuit, and that yes is what keeps you going. But this only happens if you break the dependency on outcome. If you stop telling yourself that success is only found in the result, the truth is, the result is the echo. The real transformation happens in the repetition, in the daily decision to show up when it's boring, to move when it's inconvenient, to act even when no one sees it. That's where motivation becomes anchored in identity, not I do this because I'll get something, but I do this because this is who I am. And when that shift happens, resistance loses its voice. This principle is trainable. Every time you pause to acknowledge the effort, to register progress, to lock in the feeling of movement, you reinforce the association between action and reward. It can be as small as checking off the box, as subtle as a deep breath and a nod. That micro-recognition is what wires the loop. And with enough repetition, the action itself becomes satisfying. The need to see immediate results fades because the system now finds meaning in execution. That is when motivation becomes a byproduct, not a requirement. You are not powerless in the face of low energy or distraction. You have a tool that can recondition the system, action, pure, deliberate, imperfect action. When that becomes your source of meaning, everything else speeds up. Focus sharpens, energy rises. The brain begins to expect progress and prepare for it. This is not mindset fluff. It is the neurochemical result of how you define success at the cellular level. And the more you define it as showing up and doing, the more your biology responds with clarity, fire, and forward force. You become driven not by the promise of reward, but by the rhythm of relentless execution. Effort itself can become chemically rewarding through repetition, and when it does, the entire game of performance transforms. Most people believe reward comes only after the grind, after the finish line, after the external win. But that's a fragile way to live. It keeps your nervous system in a constant loop of craving without satisfaction. It makes you dependent on validation, on metrics, on applause. But the brain wasn't designed to operate only on outcome. It was designed to adapt, and when you repeatedly meet effort with deliberate attention and internal acknowledgement, you teach your system that effort is not just a cost, it's a source of power. This process starts in the dopaminergic pathways, but it doesn't end there. It involves the way your mind interprets strain. When you lean into something difficult and recognize the effort itself as valuable, not just tolerable, but meaningful, you change the way your brain maps challenge. You begin to associate the very sensation of trying hard with progress, and that reshapes the chemistry of persistence. The synapses involved in grit begin to strengthen. The circuits involved in quitting begin to decay. Over time, the moments that used to trigger avoidance now activate pursuit. The struggle itself becomes the spark. That shift doesn't happen through willpower, it happens through repetition with intention. Every time you show up to the workout, the study session, the hard conversation, and remind yourself that the act of engaging is the reward, you are writing that code deeper into your nervous system. You're making effort the generator of drive, not the tax. And that's what separates temporary motivation from lasting fire. One fades when the reward is out of reach. The other grows every time you push forward, even when no reward is in sight. This practice becomes sacred when done consistently. You begin to feel something strange and powerful, a kind of reverence for the grind. Not masochism, not burnout, but a deep internal shift where effort no longer drains you. It builds you. It fuels you because your brain has learned to expect internal satisfaction from the moment of engagement. This is how warriors are made. This is how high performers build longevity. Not from shortcuts, but from a nervous system conditioned to receive fulfillment not after the battle, but in the middle of it. When this becomes your default mode, you stop needing to be convinced to act. You stop waiting for inspiration to strike. You move because movement has become synonymous with meaning. The resistance is still there, but it no longer owns you. You meet it with breath, posture, presence, and you proceed, not to escape it, but to transform through it. Because your biology now understands something most people never discover. That effort, when honored, becomes its own reward. And when that truth is etched into your system, your drive no longer depends on how you feel. It flows from who you've become. Deliberate stress builds dopaminergic resilience in a way no amount of passive learning ever can. The brain is not fragile, it's adaptive. But it needs challenge to wake up its deeper capacities. Controlled, intentional exposure to discomfort doesn't just build mental toughness. It recalibrates the very chemistry of motivation. Each time you step into discomfort voluntarily, you activate stress pathways that trigger dopamine release not in response to comfort, but in response to effort. And that teaches your system a new language. That strain is not punishment, it's preparation, it's signal. It's power. There are circuits in the brain, particularly in the mesocortical limbic system, that regulate how we experience challenge. These circuits don't just process stress, they link it to meaning. When you encounter a task that pushes your limits and choose to engage it with full presence, your brain rewires that experience into memory, not as trauma, but as training. The cortisol rise is met with a dopamine spike, not because the experience is easy, but because it's purposeful. And the more you do this, the more your nervous system learns that energy expenditure is not a threat. It's a sacred invitation to grow. This doesn't happen through chaos, it happens through control. It happens through structured challenges, cold exposure, fasting, intense focus sessions, disciplined training, experiences where the discomfort is real, but chosen. In those moments, you're not just pushing your limits, you're teaching your brain that you can stay calm under tension, that you can act when uncomfortable, and that you can extract reward not just from finishing, but from fighting forward. That's where dopaminergic resilience is born, not when everything feels right, but when nothing does, and you move anyway. The key to this kind of transformation is precision. Too much stress, applied without rhythm, collapses the system. Too little, and the brain stays soft, but when you hit that edge, right at the intersection of effort and choice, you forge something new. The dopamine receptors themselves become more sensitive, the reward threshold changes, you begin to crave the very effort that used to break you. Not because it's painless, but because your biology has learned that stress, when met deliberately, becomes fuel. This is how high performers generate energy when others burn out. They're not immune to pressure, they're trained in it. Their dopamine circuits don't wait for ideal conditions. They fire in the dark, they fire in the cold, they fire in silence long before anyone sees the result. That's not magic, that's exposure. That's the result of placing the nervous system under load and holding it there long enough to teach it that stress is not the enemy. Avoidance is. Deliberate stress is how you earn access to the next level of internal power. It is how you activate the ancient systems of pursuit, endurance, and drive that are already inside you but sleeping. You wake them not with words but with action, and when that action becomes ritual, when you choose the strain with intention, the brain follows. It adapts, it strengthens, it begins to release the chemicals of pursuit, not just when it's easy, but when it's hardest. And that's the edge. That's the moment you stop being reactive and start becoming unstoppable. Relentless drive emerges when discipline becomes automatic, when the circuits of daily action are no longer debated in mind, but executed by default in the body. The misconception is that discipline is about grinding through resistance with brute force every time. But the truth is, the most disciplined people are not constantly fighting themselves. They've trained themselves not to have the argument at all. Through repetition, the decision to show up, to do the hard thing, to lean into discomfort becomes encoded into the nervous system as habit, as reflex, as identity. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and execution, no longer burns energy trying to negotiate. It simply acts. In the beginning, every disciplined act feels like a battle, but with time, the brain starts to automate it. Neural pathways become more efficient. What was once effort becomes rhythm. What was once a choice becomes a pattern. And when this happens, the entire system begins to shift. Motivation is no longer the initiator, habit is. You no longer wait to feel like doing it, you simply do it. And the reward circuitry starts to recognize consistency as its own source of meaning. This is how relentless drive is built, not through occasional intensity, but through repeated obedience to structure, even in silence, even in solitude. Every time you repeat a disciplined behavior under tension, you reinforce not just the behavior, but the belief that you are someone who acts regardless of mood. That belief becomes embedded in your circuitry. Your sense of identity fuses with your actions, and once that identity is locked in, it becomes incredibly difficult to break. The system resists deviation. The same neuroplasticity that once made it hard to start now makes it hard to stop. This is the turning point where the momentum sustains itself, not by hype, not by pressure, but by design. This isn't about being robotic. It's about being prepared. It's about building a foundation so strong that when storms hit, and they will, you don't have to rethink your mission. You execute because the code has already been written into your nervous system. That is the essence of true discipline, not harshness, not punishment, but devotion to a structure that frees you from chaos. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the power to move regardless of it. And when that power becomes automatic, when action is no longer a decision but a natural extension of who you are, your drive becomes relentless not because you force it, but because you've forged it. Not through desire but through design,